of this Balaji book that just came out. And just so I kind of know the audience, like how many people have read the book or heard of it? Just raise your hand. All right, so like a lot, probably more than half. Cool. This will assume you haven't read it, so don't worry if you haven't. We'll try to like get through that quickly. And kind of the overall thing, like going to Will's point of just sort of optimism, is the thing that really struck me about Urbit is just this underlying optimism. That's why it's so fun to come to meetups, why it's so fun for me to hang out and live around Urbit people, is just there's so much optimism for the future, and they're not waiting. It's not just this sort of like, hey, we can like eventually get there. It's like, no, we're literally building this. This is going to have a really positive impact in these areas. And yes, it's not everything. There's other tools we can build, but it's this optimism of we can fix the future ourselves, which is really kind of crazy about Urbit. I'm sure a lot of you have already kind of noticed that same energy. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk is both the network state, but kind of more broadly, this concept of the network age. And this is like a super broad concept. So, you know, fortunately, my brother, Tim Luck, who runs Uqbar, he's going to be pivoting his Web Zero podcast to focus more on network age. So we'll be running that together. So there'll be a ton of content coming out on network age. So like, it's honestly something I cannot cover in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to try to give my best overview of it and why it's cool and kind of highlight some of the really exciting stuff that's happening there. And then kind of put the network state in the context of the network age and just in the broader set of kind of crypto tools that we see happening. Like now we have Sound Money, and that's kind of building, that's having massive changes. Like a lot of us were in El Salvador, Trent, Will, hanging out in El Salvador, and you know, it's the US dollar and it's Bitcoin. You know, there's Bitcoin ATMs. I can use Lightning to buy coffee. So a lot of these tools are coming, and 30% of El Salvador didn't even have a bank account. And so for us in the US, it's like whatever, like I have a lot of bank accounts. I'm not rich, but I just have a lot of bank accounts. And it's like, you know, it doesn't matter that much for me, but for someone who's never had a bank account, which is most of the developing world, this technology of Bitcoin and Lightning is massive. So we see that as kind of part of the network age, this sound money. Another core thing is sound computing. It's computing that you actually own. So that's Urbit, you know. It would be interesting if there were more projects doing that. Weirdly, it's like kind of an empty field because it's quite challenging. And that's why, you know, Talon's been at it for ages. We have a lot of awesome startups now on Urbit kind of driving that forward faster. But it's computing that you own. It's kind of like when you own a house, you can actually customize it. You can make it like you. You can kind of have it reflect your identity. Computing now, we're renting, you know. The app might go under or it might change or it might ban you. And, you know, even if you're not, a lot of people here have been banned, but even if you haven't been banned, it's still something where like, I hate my Facebook experience. I hate always having to port my social graph to each new app. I hate even the thought of telling someone to download a new app. It's just so cringe now in 2022 to be like, hey, just download like this one app and it'll make everything better. So like, I think we're all kind of like dealt with like app fatigue. And so like, sound computing is like awesome. And like a lot of the guys here, a lot of the gals and gals here are just like bringing that to life and making it so like people like I can use it. Like I want Holium to exist. And that's another huge tool of this network age. And then a third part, a part I focus a lot of my presentation on, is more about sort of like culture and community. And it's kind of like being parts of communities that you actually like the people around you. Like not that long ago, Americans actually enjoyed living near their neighbors. They actually knew their neighbors' names. They liked their communities. Like I grew up in the 90s in like a nice suburb and it was great. And like, we don't see that when we look around. Like when I think about having kids, I don't see the types of communities I would actually want to raise kids in. And then like, I personally don't like the communities I was in. They just weren't really fitting my needs. And so I think that last part, like I'm trying to kind of create the third, it's sort of like sound culture, sound community. It's a culture that you can buy into. And I think in the network age, there'll be a lot of these. Like in the industrial age, we saw, you know, communism, fascism, and then neoliberalism actually winning, right? The third one won. But there were a lot of different cultures that kind of emerged in the industrial age. I think the logic of this that we'll dig into, I think we'll see even more cultures emerging. So I don't see like, we had 3 in the industrial age and a lot that lost that competition. I think we'll probably have, you know, thousands, honestly, in this new age. So I want to like flip to the next slide and just talk a little bit about my background. I'll try to be quick because Logan's presentation is going to be awesome. Like, I don't know if you guys saw him at Consensus, but I was like, thank God I'm speaking first because like that guy has like a lot of chat energy now and I do not want to have to follow that. So yeah, this is just like, honestly, like forming our community, forming our tribe. You know, a lot of this was just completely organic. So for me, it's interesting being in Austin, Texas, because Austin was sort of I had already expatted twice, spent 2 winters in Mexico City, and I was like loving Mexico, and I was like really tempted to move abroad. And I was like, Austin was sort of the last place I was scoping out as a city I would consider living in. And I'd just gotten Urbit pilled in that spring of 2021. And I'd been hanging out with a few really good Urbit guys. My oldest brother, Tim Luck, had come out to Mexico City with a lot of my family, and then Sarpin and Tondas. So a lot of really top Urbit guys were just hanging out there. And then they're like, oh, you should go to Austin. Like Austin's sort of like the big hub of Urbit in the US. And I was like, all right. And so I like put out just like a feeler, like anyone want to meet up? And Logan was like, yeah, I'm available. And I'm like, all right. And I meet Logan, and I'm just like, it's the 4th Urbiter I think I met. And I'm just like, whoa, this guy just he's just very confident, and even confident about things I don't think he had yet known about. Like when he told me he wanted to have 12 kids, I'm not sure if that's still the case after having one. We'll see. But clearly he's doing great off of 1 kid. So maybe just keep going. And then he was very confidently telling me about Argentina, a country I had lived in and he hadn't been to. So that was actually just a harbor of things to come in Urbit, where there's so much confidence and a lot of knowledge, but also sometimes you're like, wait, this person hasn't been to Argentina. They're telling me they're going to move their family there. It's like, what have you? Okay. Yeah. So for me, after that meeting, I just started hanging out with more Urbit guys. So I went to Bitcoin Miami, got connected to Ted Blackman, one of the great devs, core devs, Ravnis Rickfer. And then I convinced him to like ditch his like kind of lonely existence in Appalachia and come out to Ukraine, because like Tim was there, he was studying Russian. So we hung out, we got Sarp in there. It was just sort of this organic picking up of more and more people, as we're just like, hey, forming a tribe is fun. Getting to live abroad is fun. Like a lot of us had wanted to live abroad, and then we were stuck in offices for like the first, 5 to 10 years. Although weirdly, we have a lot of 22-year-olds as well. So some of them have never been in an office and never even been to college. So there's a mix. But yeah, overall, it was basically just sort of organically picking up people. And then fortunately, we had already planned to go to Mexico City from Kyiv. So sort of Kyiv, Urbit moved over to Mexico City for the winter because it's cold in Kyiv in the winter. Fortunately, we were ahead of the war. And so I'll kind of dive into the Ukraine experience, because it's actually it's a really interesting one, and one that kind of highlights a lot of this network age, and kind of like having a war in Ukraine is like the worst thing that could happen to Kyiv Urbit. And weirdly, like you look around, it's like everyone who was in Kyiv is like totally fine. In some ways, like doing better. Like Tim's in a Tuscan villa. A lot of the like Ted's in Portugal, and people are kind of, thriving in spite of the worst thing that could happen. So a lot of this talk is just literally trying to give you some exposure to what's already happening, try to lay out some of this vision for the future, and then also just be like, kind of like, hey, you don't need to like move abroad. Just like take a vacation, hang out with people that you like. Just try to like just be a little bit more proactive about your own life, because you can actually change your context, and you can exit to something where you can actually thrive. So if you're not thriving now and you don't really feel awesome in your area, I would just say like go on a vacation, hang out with people you already like, and like see where you want to live. So you kind of are more or less in control. You don't have to like form a tribe like this process was. You could join one, and that's like, we'll kind of go into that as well. So yeah, overall, just a really organic process. And it's kind of one that we're trying to, like, I think a theme of this cyber age of this network age is that when people have built up this information, it's so much easier for the next person. So when we did Mexico City, it was so much simpler than doing Kyiv Urbit, because it's like, we already know how to live abroad. We know how to do visas. We know how to do our taxes. All these things get easier and easier. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of theoretical background that kind of like led to where we are, and then also kind of frame the network state. So who here has read Sovereign Individual? Okay, interestingly, network state actually has more people who have read it. I would encourage everyone who liked network state to also read Sovereign Individual. One of the best books, but most poorly titled books of all time. And I think a reason people are reading network state and not Sovereign Individual is that like sort of like lolitarian title, like Sovereign Individual. Like no one wants to be like out in like, remember like the Free State movement in New Hampshire, where like bears were just like rampaging around because they'd like gotten rid of all garbage services. So no one actually wants that. But what Sovereign Individual did a really, really good job of is laying out sort of the logic of an age. So as we move from industrial into network age, like what is the underlying logic? Like I talked about sound money, it's money, it's like banks on your phone. I talked about sound computing. It's like honestly more or less freedom of speech. Like if you own computing, no one can shut you up. It's kind of like resistance, it's search and seizure resistance. So it's basically, let's take the Bill of Rights and it's like, oh, it's like mostly there. And like, that's kind of the logic of this age is like, you don't really need a sovereign to give you the rights that you used to have as American. It's just sort of built into like the de facto tools that a lot of people here are working on. So Sovereign Individual laid out Bitcoin from 1997. It like actually predicted Bitcoin. It's crazy. Like it's still evergreen 25 years later. So it did a phenomenal job. I'd say Yarvin, you know, the stud down there in the bottom right, a lot of us are here because of him. He built Urbit. He also was just a phenomenal writer, right? So he was able to bring a lot of the ideas of Sovereign Individual, make it more just like kind of accessible because it was fun writing, like his patchwork writing. I was just rereading it. Will was rereading it as well. And we're like, wow, this thing's like really applicable to what we're doing, patchwork. You just find and replace the word land with like mines and you're there. Like, why are we trying to own land? What we're trying to do is much broader than that. And I'll talk about the digital layer in a sec. And then we have network state. So network state, I was frankly a little disappointed in it, not to be like an asshole to Balaji. I think Balaji's awesome. I just thought like, 25 years after Sovereign Individual, we would have like got this like huge leap forward in like, we're already living this. So why is there no empirical knowledge? Why is the theory not further than Sovereign Individual? In some ways, it's actually behind it, despite citing Sovereign Individual. So yeah, it was sort of like mixed reviews of network state. I think the main thing, and I'm kind of concerned that's going to confuse a lot of people, that you have to just network online before you do anything in the physical world. I think a better way to do it, and Balaji has a lot of awesome ideas in there, like society as a service. He did mines, not land. So he has a lot of great memes in there. What he's kind of missing that I noticed in network state is really you want to own the back end. You want it to be digital. You want the social graph owned. So you basically want your contact list from your phone. You want to own that. You want to own your Facebook contacts, and you want to be able to just iterate whatever front end you want on that back end. That's kind of what you want. And how people get connected into your organization doesn't really matter if it's because you tweeted out or because they hung out with you in Costa Rica at like Will's Resort. It doesn't really matter. The key is you have this sort of incredibly solid foundation of a social graph you own on the back end. That's what Urbit's like providing in a huge, huge way. And Balaji is a board member of the Urbit Foundation, so it's good. I think we can get him there. But that's kind of what I think was missing. And then if we go to the next slide, I think a big area that I just hear time and time again, like people are confused on, is this idea of like digital versus physical. And people tend to gravitate towards one or the other. Like my oldest brother insists upon never traveling, and that he wants to have like a person come up and have him and like speak through a mouthpiece because he just wants to live in Italy with his family and never wants to travel again. He did expat for like 15 years. So it's not like he's never traveled, but, and then me, I just like to hang out with people. So I tend to be the exact opposite. So I see, especially on Urbit, like people like Ted Blackman, who's Urbit pilled a ton of people. He's just like very physically native. And then there's some who just like to hang out digitally. Like Sarpin is actually way stronger digitally. He's like incredibly persuasive digitally. And then, yeah, and so I want to use this example of a digital overlay. Instead of talking about physical versus digital, we've all used Google Maps, we may not have read Network State, but we've all used Google Maps. And what Google Maps is doing is basically, it's providing a digital overlay. So you don't need to have memorized where every single cafe is when you move to a new city. Or if you're just in Austin and you're trying to figure out a cafe, you just pull up the cafe filter, and this nice digital overlay spreads out across the entire city. And it's the same with like a ton of apps. Like Tinder is basically a digital overlay for dating, where like, if you're going to go to Argentina, you can like teleport there digitally ahead of time and talk to people and line up dates. People do this all the time when they travel. And there's so many of these apps that are basically more or less just providing a better physical experience. Like no one wants to walk the streets of Austin and be like, all right, where's a nice cafe? Now, like when I'm walking the streets of Austin, I'm like, all right, if I see a cafe, I still check on Google to make sure it's not like a shitty cafe that looks nice. So this, I think basically we're going to go I think ultimately a lot of things will be digital overlays on top. And a lot of what I'm working on is basically doing a societal overlay on top of the world. So you can basically know that you'll actually have people you can hang out with. And sort of like how Will and Ben created a really cool hangout spot at Assembly where, I was talking to Justin earlier, and it's like, hey, this is a spot where I meet people. It's sort of like the hub. And we'll kind of talk about the hub and spoke model further in on this. But the general idea is, like, it's really useful to have physical spaces where you can network. Trent had the kind of terminology of, this is just higher velocity of ideas. When we come to meetups like this, we just get ideas faster and we make connections that we might not have made digitally because maybe the person isn't even on Urbit. Like, I've met a few people here today who aren't on Urbit yet. And when I went to the Yarvin meetup in New York, like almost none of those people are on Urbit yet. So it's sort of like, we can create a lot of new connections and we can accelerate the kind of rapidity of ideas through these kind of meetups. And so that's the social layer. I think in the future, you'll be able to see, like, okay, just imagine you open your phone and you go to like Urbit Filter and there's hubs around the world and you're like, oh, that's cool. I can like rent a house near this hub and then I'll have a co-working space and friends to talk to. And, it's honestly, I'm talking a lot about Urbit in this context, but the demand is really like broad throughout even Web 2 and then also crypto. Like, if you live in Mexico City, there's just like routine crypto events happening, NFT parties. Milady does their raves in New York. Praxis does their parties in New York. So basically the crypto world is moving very quickly into the digital, recognizing that there is this value. And so what we're doing is sort of securing more or less like the social overlay on top of that. Next slide. Yeah, so I wanted to give a quick study. I talked about Ukraine. This guy's interesting. It's Vitaly. He was actually a pretty early star holder. And we met Vitaly randomly because my brother and Sarpin tend to argue really loudly. And so they were in a Ukrainian cafe arguing about Bitcoin. And then the Bitcoin core dev was also working in that same cafe. There's really not many core devs. And he like tweeted out, like, can't I get like a moment's peace at a cafe without someone arguing about like Bitcoin? Like, even this cafe is ruined with sort of this Ukrainian's attitude. And that led to like this connection where Vitaly organized a dinner for basically a crypto meetup to kind of, he's always been interested in Urbit, as I said, kind of like sees it as part of the sovereign stack, like self-owned computing. It's interesting because he was running this big crypto network, like a lot of his devs were the keynote speakers of Crypto Kyiv and all the conferences there. And then the war happens and he's a male between 18 and 65, so he can't legally leave the country. But of course he gets out because he's not poor. And then not only does he get out, he uses his network to get all of his developers out. So now all of his developers are in Portugal working on the same project. Like, go back 50 years or even 20 years, would an entrepreneur, when their country goes to war, like be able to get all of their network and business out and like not even miss a beat? It was the same for my brother when he fled from Kyiv. Didn't disrupt Uqbar whatsoever. So it's really interesting. We see that new logic and we're just sort of like just tapping into it, but that's like a key theme where basically you can be mobile now because it's business without borders. You can move your entire operation without really disruption. And now, what was the value for Vitaly? It's like, well, physically he got his guys out of Kyiv. So like there's a lot of value to being in that network. But there's also a lot of value that his devs were doing. And so we see this kind of like new age entrepreneur emerging with Vitaly. And it's just like, honestly, it's like hard to even translate in because I think it's going to be massively impactful. This idea of like, you can move your business anywhere, even if a government tries to hit you. Like, let's pretend Ukraine didn't go to war with Russia. Let's pretend Ukraine had tried to crack down on crypto. He'd be in Portugal the next day with all of his devs. So like, I hear a lot of FUD about like, what if governments try to stop this? The reality is these networks are so much more mobile than like a massive Ford factory in Michigan. Like, good luck moving that factory in Michigan. If Michigan clamps down on you, you have to take whatever the government gives you in that situation. Here, he's in the driving seat. And like, interestingly, there had been talk of not just crypto, but a dev clamp down in Ukraine before the war. That was sort of in the works because the devs were making so much money in both Web 2 and crypto in Ukraine that the Ukrainian politicians were getting nervous that like this new basically social class was kind of emerging to rival their power. But that's like what you are as Urbiters. Like, your power is actually worrying to governments because it's like you have money, you have experience, you're mobile. And so just kind of happy to go into that more, but basically Yeah, I think Vitali is a really interesting one, but I mean, Uqbar is the same way. So if you're involved with Uqbar, they also had to get a few people out. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so I think there's a few reactions to this new network age. One is just sort of pretend it's not happening. I see that a lot in sort of my Harvard networks. I was at a wedding in New York last Saturday, and everyone's just like, yeah, we still work at Goldman. Yeah, we still just like launch whatever app. And like, they kind of sense it's not going great, and they're sort of eyeing the exit, but they're not really up to making exit. And so they're just kind of like, oh, what's over there? And like, so everyone's kind of watching now and being like, oh, should we exit too? Like, and what does exit even mean? There's so little clarity about this. Does exit mean I have to leave the US? It doesn't. If you're running a token company, yeah, probably leave the US and talk to a lawyer, unfortunately. The other is sort of isolate and wait it out. I've seen that a lot actually in Urbit, where people are like, all right, you know, the US isn't the way I want it to be. It's not the way I grew up in it. But I'm just going to like rent a house away from everyone and like raise my kids the way I want to raise them. And like, yeah, that kind of works for you. You can just push out code, it'll be fine. But like, it's not really a great way to raise children. Like, it's sort of like, honestly, kind of cowardly. When like the reality is like the leadership positions in this new age are like wide open, and there's like a lot you could be doing proactively. So I don't know. If you don't have any ideas, I think isolate and wait is fine. But part of this presentation is to hopefully give you a couple ideas in terms of how to be proactive and not wait it out. Next slide. Yeah, so there's a little bit, I like to think a lot of the frontier, part of the Balaji book I really liked was the emphasis on the frontier, how America was sort of founded as a frontier society. Will and Trent had recommended this book of Plymouth Foundation, which is like a first-hand account by William Bradford. It's insanely interesting. And like, interestingly, it actually talks a lot about marketing. He's like, oh, like, what's the problem with this whole Plymouth Foundation plantation thing? He's like, you know, our marketing's really bad in the UK. He's like, people just keep bad mouthing us, and they keep saying like it's this shitty like cults. And so like, interestingly, even in like 1620, they were still dealing with marketing. It's like the ultimate thing when you're out on the frontier is like, there's a lot of people who aren't on the frontier who are kind of forming the narrative around you. The great news about being on the frontier today is it's not like Plymouth Foundation where you have like a 50% mortality rate in 6 months. This is like, we've had actually a 0% mortality rate even with the war. So it's just awesome. And yeah, and so what we see with this frontier is you can kind of already see it a lot with ETH. If you ever hang out with ETH people, I used to be a Bitcoin maxi. Now I'm sort of like 50-50 just for full disclosure. Although Tim's really working to make me 100% ETH. In terms of everything on the frontier is being built out in parallel. So we're using parallel computing, we're using Urbit, we're using parallel money, Bitcoin or ETH or whatever the heck you use. And then like we're hiring a lot of the stuff you see in Urbit now, it's internal, right? It's like a lot of Uqbar's raise was people who had been in that group, the collapse. A lot of their hires are people who had, you know, gone through Hoon School. So a lot of this entire economy is actually operating internally now. That's like really important because like, at a certain point, it's like, all right, the Goldman Sachs iBanker doesn't get this, but like, do we even need them? Or how much do we need them? Do we need them at like a Series A instead of a seed? So this is really changing the logic of the entire frontier. And then in addition to the frontier, it's a lot of its own culture. You know, a lot of like your social status within Urbit is just like, have you built something for Urbit, or what are you actually doing that would help? Like, who cares what college you went to or like what job you had before? It's like, how are you actually building the future we want? And then kind of related to that, it's also, you know, it's sort of the values, and it's sort of weird watching a tribe form values. It's not something I expected to see when I was like 25, to kind of watch people like talk about values. And like, we have a slide on that. Balaji's big on have your commandment. So I threw that in there. I don't love the slide, but yeah, I threw that in there because he was, and I'll show you the commandment eventually. But I'd say the core here is like, yeah, we are going on the frontier. The frontier though is very networked. It's very tied back to the US. It's very tied back globally. And so you don't need to go anywhere in particular. But if you go hang out in person, you'll probably make connections faster, like how to do smart contracts on Urbit. I watched happen in real time in Mexico City when like Hazad was talking to Ravnis Rikfer. So like you see the connections, and then you see its ultimate production in code. So it's kind of just like you don't have to do it, but I just say the velocity of ideas is moving way faster, and you don't have to deal with sort of the negative culture where it's like, hey, we can't really vote our way out of this anymore. Next slide. Yeah, so another area I was just kind of like, I was doing a lot of reading and just like also just like applying it. And I was just like, all right, what should I like say around like a model for pioneering on this frontier? And then I was like, well, why not just like look at what we did and what we're doing? And like what we did was basically like phase one was just like we rented Airbnbs in countries we thought were cool around people that we thought would be interesting to talk to. So that was like Mexico City for me. And then once I got more into Urbit, you know, Kyiv, Mexico City, Costa Rica, El Salvador. So it's basically just like you're not selling your house, you're not doing anything dramatic. Just like I didn't sell my houses when I went abroad. Just like go on vacation and see if you like the lifestyle, if you're getting better ideas, if your company's moving forward faster because you're around interesting people. Like for me personally, I just like build so much faster in the right environment. Like even just like walking around the pool, I was working on this book about the network age, and I was like looking back and I was like, I did like 9 chapters when I was in El Salvador. I've done like 1 since in like 3 weeks. So it's just interesting. Like you probably each have your own place where you really are productive. And I would just kind of, you know, like be quantitative about that. Like think about where are you being productive, and like if you're not being productive, you're not happy, like just go on a vacation, go figure out, but go on a vacation with a purpose. Like go to like BitMEP's resort. It's awesome. A lot of guys are there. And then phase 2, this is the phase we're entering now. Like we did phase 1, I was doing it personally for about 2 years and a lot of other guys for about a year. And eventually you're just like, okay, I found places I like El Salvador, I like Mexico City. Why don't I just like why don't I get a lease there? You know, it sounds like a big commitment now after having sold my houses and put everything in a storage unit, but I'm like, all right, I'm going to get a 12-month lease. And the reason for that is basically then we can form the kind of hubs that you have here in Austin, where you can have routine meetups where people can know like, all right, you just go to this house and you can co-work. So we're renting a mansion in Austin. It's really cool. We'll show a few photos of it, but basically, yeah, it's just like a way to start being more intentional about it and to start scaling it so that people who are like, oh, it might be fun to go to El Salvador, can be like, oh, there's actually something there and I'm not like taking this risk and I don't have to coordinate. So we're going to move a lot faster. Phase 4, I'll skip through phase 3. It's like you just start buying things you want. That's sort of intuitive, like buying restaurants, just investing more deeply in places you like. Phase 4 is basically the network state from Balaji. I would argue heavily you don't really need the state, but I'm going to move a lot faster through the next couple slides. Will's checking time. All right, cool. So this is more or less our vision. I would just say like, you know, more or less America had these values and they were actually protected for a long time. And now a lot of us here are just more or less building the tools so that we don't have to rely on someone else to ensure these. To some extent, though, it's very good. Like in the case of the Ukrainians, when they had that network built out where they could actually go abroad and they had people who could get them across the border, handle the right bribes, get them the visas into Portugal. So it still is physical in some ways, but a lot of it's just like crypto tools that we've built out and that are very far along. Next slide. So Aleph, it's basically we're doing society as a service. So we're just building out the social layer. It's pretty organic. So like next step is basically, I'll talk about the 2 hubs in Mexico City and El Salvador. But yeah, it's really just trying to make it easier for the next incremental person, lower like kind of the marginal cost of exit and kind of give you the sort of the social benefits, the tax benefits, the legal advice to just make this way smoother. And also just like give you a network where you can just plug in and be like, I want to work like what Librex does. He works from El Salvador for a week and then he goes back to New York. So yeah, just lowering the cost of that. Next slide. Initiatives. So yeah, broad initiatives. I'm going to like go through this really quickly, but basically content production around that podcast I mentioned, a lot more networking happening, mostly abroad, honestly. I want to work with Will more fully on kind of that network state conference idea. And then lastly, just sort of building out the digital networks so that we're connected even when we're not in the same geographic location. Next slide. Timing, just like very quickly, a lot of this has already happened or is happening. So we basically finished phase 1. We're doing a lot more intentional meetups and kind of starting to invest our own money into these things. It's kind of cool because like even for phase 2, you can basically just do multi-sigs and like put together social event budgets through multi-sigs and just say like, hey, let's like throw in some money to hold a meetup, get some beers, hang out, throw a party, rent houses together. So a lot of it's organic at even phase 2, which gets people most of what they want. Phase 3, you can kind of do, I'll kind of talk about that financial model later, but that'll kind of be essentially phase 2 is starting in October is when we really move forward with phase 2 of leasing houses in Mexico City and El Salvador. Next slide. So yeah, I like this hub and spoke model. I've talked a little bit about the hubs. I would say like the easiest way to think of hub and spokes is basically Austin already has a hub and spokes. Like it has a hub, it has assembly capital where you can go and co-work, get office space, conference rooms, meet cool people, and then it also has, of course, like the spokes would just be like everything else in Austin. Like it doesn't need to be centrally managed. There's no reason to have it. Like no one wants to all live at a community house. So why not? You just like form the core community and culture as the hub, and then you kind of let the spokes organically grow from that. Although I'll kind of talk through in 2 slides about exact spokes I saw in El Salvador that are really helpful and I think kind of bring this along. So the next one, this is just a slide on the hub, very quick. So we just want to, it's like very easy to rent mansions abroad. Someone's even launching like a castle DAO, which is interesting. So yeah, it's just like super easy on Airbnb. You can rent mansions and like they're really nice spaces. A few people want to co-live together. They can kind of intentionally set the culture, and then other people can just come hang out at the mansion. The one we're renting has like 4 living rooms and 6 levels. So it's just like an easy place for you to go co-work. It'll also just have like a cook and a maid, so it's clean and good food. I've learned that ETH developers are not very clean. That's one insight. Next slide. And then the spokes, just like seeing what works. In El Salvador, we ended up having 2 villas at the end of the day. We had like this sort of degen house with a lot of performance enhancing drugs, like Adderall, for them. And they kind of lived a certain lifestyle of like steaks sort of thawing in the pool. And then we had sort of a clean house where we could actually have people over. I think the gentleman Jack from Austin, I think he got to see both, so he'll say that. I think Trent and Will had already left by then. But yeah, the spokes, you basically like you have the hub, that's the core culture, and then you can just like build off like almost infinite spokes that make it a better experience. Like you could have a coding house, as I mentioned. You can do schools. We're launching a school initiative, and so yeah, and then you can just like start holding like the volcano raves are like something that's near and dear to my heart, and we have like the dude in El Salvador, the elite guy who just owns an entire volcano, weirdly. Like that's, I'll talk a little bit about stuff like, what the heck? Like, okay, I thought I had like hung out with like kind of like rich people. Like I was this Goldman bank. This guy's just like, oh yeah, I just own a volcano. He's like, you want to cut a volcano? Like you just own it? Like how? He's like, I just bought it like last year. You're like, what? It's like the biggest volcano in El Salvador. And it's just like, yeah, come ATV and stuff. Like we'll have fun. And like, that's what I love about going abroad, frankly, is just the effort of, it's more fun to build abroad and it's so much cheaper and easier. And everyone's just like weirdly open, especially in certain countries. Like Ukraine was that way, El Salvador is that way. Mexico and Portugal, other kind of interesting countries, aren't quite. But in the interest of time, you know, if you want to know specifics about countries, just message me offline. We'll keep going. Cool. So we did a couple interviews with people who are living abroad, just from different backgrounds. I won't go into that now, but like those are up. Feel free to DM me for those. We'll also try to eventually get those up onto our website. But yeah, Ted, I mean, awesome, very early developer, core dev of, he did Urbit from the inside out. Highly, highly recommend. That really Urbit pilled me. Great guy. Jake is really interesting. He's doing like a clinical trial of himself in Prospera in Honduras. And I think, yeah, like one of the guys who runs that is here. So like Jake's just always on the frontier of like health. It's like crazy. And then Will, he's my second oldest brother, one below Tim. He works for Tim, front end developer. He's been traveling Europe with 2 kids, doing a different city every single week. And I'm like, it was actually news to me when I talked to him. I was like, what? So I interviewed him about just like traveling with kids, because a lot of people have young kids and like they're like, oh, can I live abroad with young kids? So that's an interesting one. If you're kind of curious, can you do it? I'd say 100% yes, although I wouldn't do a city a week. Next slide. Yeah, just like costs, the general vibe, like why are these people living abroad? They generally just say over and over, like we're living twice as well. Like we go out to eat way more and we like literally save twice as much. So we're like living twice as well for half the cost. It's kind of interesting. I have a lot more cost breakdowns if you're interested, but like generally what I notice is people just eat out a ton and like have way more social time abroad. And then they end up just saving more because you don't really pay taxes, especially if you're married. Next. Yeah, so we explored a lot. I would just like kind of rule out Australia because it's now terrible. And then Asia has a bad time zone. Like people used to love expatting from Asia. It's like great in terms of cost of living and scenery, but like the time zones really suck. So like it's hard to get people to Asia in general, unfortunately. Africa doesn't quite have the infrastructure yet, although I'm kind of very excited when it does. I think it'll be really awesome. Europe has great infrastructure for this. Really good visa programs out of Portugal, you can do like an EU visa like super easily. So if you're interested in that, I have like a guide on that. Obviously free. I'll just give it to you. South America, good time zone, nice infrastructure. People love Medellin. So we've kind of scoped out a lot. US, I'm not going to go into like reasons not to be in the US. If you're looking to move abroad, it's probably because you have your own reasons. Next slide. Phase 2, the difference between phase 1 and 2 for locations is kind of like, where did places actually show kind of people market fit? Like, where do people actually like living? You could live in anywhere, but like, where do people actually end up congregating? It's mostly like Lisbon, parts of Europe. Weirdly, Ukraine was actually pretty good for crypto, especially because it had like easy exchange. And then Medellin, Costa Rica, El Salvador has a huge crypto scene now, weirdly. And then Mexico City is like much bigger. So those are the places that actually showed fit. If you're wondering like where are the communities, it's kind of like these blue dots. Next one. Phase 3 is like kind of hard because like you need, if you want to invest money into like a country, it's sort of like harder in general. Like you need lawyers and it's just like more of a process. Like I'm sure Will could talk about that with Costa Rica. And so like I would mostly want to do a phase 3 in like a place that has a stable government. And it's like, yeah, like there's a big reason to invest. Like ideally the government is working with you. So El Salvador is very down to work. Mexico like doesn't work with you, but they're so expat friendly that it still kind of works. And then Lisbon's kind of the same. They just want a ton of expats living there and they're very crypto friendly. Next slide. I think we kind of like more or less talked about these. I mean, Mexico City is just like a great cultural hub. People love living in Mexico City. There's like articles out in the LA Times yesterday about how too many people are moving there. So that kind of gives you a sense. It's just a very European city. And like I've lived there 3 winters and it's awesome. And yeah, a lot of people want to live there. Yeah, next slide. Financials, I would just say like look at sort of Selena.com for financials. They did a really cool thing where they got to $1 billion valuation off of just running co-working and co-living spaces, like basically very high-end hostels. So it's not like a gross hostel like you may or may not stayed in. It's like a beautiful space and they're incredibly popular across Latin America. They have 175 locations. They're a nice place to stay. There's like 2 in Santa Teresa near Will. Mainly they like suck on culture. You basically are hanging out with complete randos and you like, it's not that fun. I way prefer hanging out with Urbit people. But their financial model is really good. You can basically cover expense. They're incredibly cash flow positive just off of running that model because there's so many nomads now. I think the upside is more monetizing networks. Like why was SF real estate so valuable? It's not just the scenery. It's also like there's lots of scenic parts of the US, like Utah. It's the scenery plus the people they had gotten to go there. So there was such demand there. So you can monetize networks. It's kind of like its own slide deck. So I'm not going to talk about it. I would say the nice thing about monetizing networks is like you can invest back into the people. And like, what if SF had actually invested back in the people? We'd probably all be living there. Next slide. Yeah, he's involved. So Will's been great advising, especially on just like general, like almost like the physical realm that Tim's bad at. And Tim's been really good advising on like the digital realm that he's sort of given up on the physical. Yeah, and then currently, yeah, bootstrapping it. But as I mentioned, phase 2 is mostly just like exceedingly easy to bootstrap from the network because Urbit people have money and time to do this. Next slide. So yeah, I would just say like we'll be hosting a lot of stuff in Latin America after assembly. So if you're interested, you know, just like do a vacation. If you want more information, just like message me. Yeah, and I would say just like, yeah, feel free to also talk to the people who've done it before. And thanks so much for your time. I don't think we have time for questions, but I'll be around.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nilrun. Really appreciate that. Let's take like a 2-minute break, go to the bathroom. We'll come back and Logan will talk about Uqbar. our office. So really appreciative to him. Hey, we're starting up. So if you're having side conversations, let's wrap it up. Awesome. And then I also wanted to announce on behalf of the foundation, like if you're enjoying hanging out with this Urbit crowd and what we're doing, definitely check out Assembly Miami. It's going to be in September, urbit.org. You can check it out. But without further ado, tacryt-socryp.
Nice. Thanks everybody for coming out. So let's see. It's pretty late for me. I generally go to bed super early because I'm waking up every day at like 6 or 7 with this kid. Yeah, he's a champ, but it's way past his bedtime, so I'll keep it pretty short and sweet. So basically, the point of the talk that I'm here to give today is to tell you guys that the NOC VM has extreme advantages in the blockchain environment that I don't really see people talking about enough. And further, I would also make the claim that none of the other layer 1 chains or really even layer 2 chains that have their own VM, which is all of them, unless they're using someone else's VM, I would make the claim that none of those other virtual machines basically take the part of building a blockchain, of building a virtual machine very seriously. So in other words, what I'm saying is a lot of these blockchains really, really want to focus on things like the game theory, or they want to focus on their marketing, or they want to focus on, you know, their native bridging functionality or whatever so that they can get value from other networks. But what a lot of these people are not focused on is they're not at all focused on the actual traits of the virtual machine that they're dealing with. And so, in other words, you can kind of get a few takeaways from that pretty quickly, because especially with chains like Solana, where basically you have them targeting these very traditional languages with their VMs, like, oh, you know, you can compile this into our Solana thing and just run this, you know, programming language you already know, or Solidity, where Solidity is obviously the key case study of people who didn't care about the VM that they were making. They were just trying to make something that worked. And you can look at these environments, and very, very clearly there are some extremely large drawbacks. And some of those drawbacks are in the case of Solidity or some of the bespoke languages, and there's so many at this point that I'm not even going to list them, that in essence, nobody wants to learn that language because you can only do things with that one blockchain on it. It's not transferable. And also, it's very clear when you're kind of interacting with the language that, well, nobody actually cared that much to make the language other than to make it look like JavaScript or whatever so that you jump on it. And you're kind of like using it and you're like, well, this is kind of shitty. You know, it's like, wow, like where are my strict types? Where are my dependent types? Where's any of the things that would actually make writing code easy or simple or tractable? And instead they focus on this like ease of developer onboarding and that really like that first initial look at it. You're like, wow, I saw this for the first time and it looked like JavaScript. Wait, I can learn that. That's the moment that they're all trying to inspire. Other than the ones that, you know, don't have their own language and are using Rust or C or whatever. And of course those have their own problems because at the end of the day they're all essentially targeting like LLVM, right? They're targeting LLVM IR, and at that point you're like, wow, you guys are basically not self-hosting at all. You guys are just writing to this like crazy, very, very large virtual machine spec. And so I bet many of you can kind of see where I'm going with this, which is that basically there are massive advantages to having a very, very small virtual machine spec. And in a lot of cases, people in the traditional operating system world, for the longest time, anytime they would see Urbit, they would say, wow, like why would you want not to only have a few instructions? And it's actually incredible to only have a few instructions when you're writing a NOC interpreter, which is what I've been doing for the past 3 months or so in building the transaction engine. And what I would like to kind of put forward to all of you as my key proposal is that basically if you can't write a blockchain in 6 months that's best in class with your language, or with your VM, you're doing it wrong. And so basically, what we've done with Uqbar is impossible to do anywhere else. Literally, show me an example. I would love to see one. And so basically, I'll get into what makes the text so good, other than just that we're able to do something this fast at all. But also, you get a bunch of benefits for free from having such a very simple spec. Our language is self-hosted, so that our language literally runs on itself. Our language not only runs on itself, but has extremely easy other use cases for that language. Wow, you have a whole personal server operating system that you can just use, that you can do things with outside of your blockchain environment. So you don't just have to write your smart contract and then go write your Node.js kludge to build your little website with your web store. You can just write, you can write Hoon, which is Nock, go write some more Hoon, and then go write some more Hoon, and then you're done. Boom. Show me how you could do that with Solana, or God, you wouldn't even want to do it with Solidity, no? And so that has its own advantages that we're not really even going to be able to see until we actually have this live and people are just hacking on this permissionlessly and building insane shit where they never have to context switch. They just literally write in one language and they're done, and they have some crazy fucking web store or whatever. So further, I would go even further with this, of course. And I'm basically the intention of this talk was to talk to you guys about the transaction engine, because that's my favorite part of Uqbar, probably because that's the part that I've been working on with Ben so much. So our transaction engine, we like to call it mill, because the state that's in our blockchain is called the granary. Every little kind of bit of state is a grain. And we have two different types of grains. We have grains that represent data. So, this could be how much money is in your account. This could be whether you have permission in this DAO to spend some money or something. It could be arbitrary state. And then the other primitive that we have is a smart contract, which we call wheat. So we have our granary, it has rice and wheat in it. And then when we go to actually execute these transactions, we mill the grain. We like to use metaphors in Urbit because otherwise I could just tell you that the transaction goes into the transaction processor and runs process transaction. And, then everybody would just be, only the autists would actually like it, because in essence, we love autists at Urbit, gotta represent, right? But basically people just like metaphors better. You can think about it easier if you're using little words that are nice metaphors, and all the terms are arbitrary anyway. So might as well use nice ones that you like. So basically, what we've done with the mill is we do a bunch of validation checks, and then we pop our wheat, which we do some nice custom steps on to actually build out. So basically, each individual smart contract has a fixed standard library that we've defined that has certain jets, that has certain smart lib functions. So basically certain standard library functions that you would be able to use with anything. So we've fixed that for every smart contract. And instead of each one of those smart contracts needing to store that whole smart library, that whole standard library, and then be able to call those functions over and over again, or instead of you being able to specify the whole thing yourself and us just saying, well, whatever, we've specified it for people such that basically the advantage is that we get to specify all the jets. We get to say, these are the jetted operations. You can run these jetted operations. And with libraries, you can include any Hoon you want. So it's not that you can't include your own stuff, but we say you're going to be executing against this particular standard library, which in our case gives us a very easy upgrade story too for smart contracts, which is to say, you just run a shard and this new shard has a new version of the standard library. So first thing we do when we are executing a smart contract call is we say, okay, let's put together your contract using the standard library and the little pieces of it that we've kind of dissected such that we're storing the minimum amount possible on chain. So once we've put it together, then we can actually run it. And so we run it through a custom Nock interpreter that I've written with another man in this room, Phil. And this Nock interpreter is called Zinc, but we run it through a little wrapper called Zebra. We call it Zebra because, I'm fixating on the names because I think it's funny more so than anything. But basically, the actual Hoon virtual Nock interpreter that's running Nock in Hoon is called Mule. So we have a zero knowledge version of this, which we, of course, call Zebra. And so basically, we run our custom Nock interpreter that has a bounded gas function that we wrote that also generates pre-processed hashes of the actual individual constituent components of the knock instructions for being fed into our knock prover. So the point of doing this transaction process is to determine, well, are we going to include it in this batch? And if so, what order did it go in? And then further, we want to also tell you, we want to say, okay, it used this much gas, or you ran out of gas, so whatever, screw you, you've lost your money. Or, of course, it went into the batch, and now we have all of the data that we need and metadata in order to generate you your lovely zero-knowledge proof, such that this thing can be included onto the chain, and no one actually has to really trust it. Okay, so that's kind of the process. You take in your raw data, you assemble your smart contract, and then you generate your zero-knowledge proof of it once you determine if it succeeds. But something that's really, really interesting about building out this system is that it basically reconstitutes, in some ways, the design space of the Urbit kernel system vein, or kernel module, GAL, which is the user space module. So each contract is essentially untrusted user code that you're going to run in some context that cannot crash. You know that it can't crash. And also, you basically are restricting its access to your system and the namespace in general and the I/O that it can do. But you're going to run this knock, and if it takes too long, you're going to stop it because of the gas function. And so basically, we have built essentially a custom user space kernel module in some form or fashion with different design constraints in 6 months in a totally self-hosted language, and also built out an entire build system for actually taking Hoon that some contract developer wrote and then turning it into our nice minimized compressed custom format which we can then assemble on the fly using our standard library. So in other words, we've built out a totally untrusted code execution VM in an extremely short period of time. And the reason we were able to do that and be so confident in the security traits of this code is that it's just all in knock. And because it's all in knock, the knock language is so simple that basically we've been able to elide, I would say probably, I don't know, 10 times, 100 times, can you even measure it? The complexity that these other people are having to deal with. So basically, we're having a good time with this stuff. So what are some of the fun things that we've had time to add into this thing other than basic transaction execution with all this free time that we have? Well, first off, in the past 2 weeks, Ben and I have actually added a strict typing system to the inputs and outputs to these contracts, in which the actual types are stored on chain, and contract input can be validated against those types prior to being fed to the contract. And of course, if you choose not to validate the types prior to feeding it, the contract will probably just crash or something. There's nothing crazy that would happen. But it's super fun that you can actually do a strict type system for the contract inputs at all in this way. It's actually really, really cool and unique and novel. You might call it state of the art. And we were able to do that thing in 2 weeks. Okay, what are some other fun things that we were able to do? Well, we were able to generate a compressed type of type in this type system such that you're not storing fully structured massive Hoon types on the chain, which would be massive. And so instead we actually have what we don't really have a name for it. I guess, well, we do. It's called a lump, but you could think of it as a mini type. And so these mini types basically are compressed forms of types that can then be perfectly inflated to a real type that you can use to validate your inputs and outputs, which is nuts. You don't see anything like this anywhere else because their languages suck and their OS sucks, and basically they're using glue to make their thing even work. And with most of these things, like it's kind of a joke to even say it's self-sovereign because the degree of complexity necessary requires large companies to keep basically security holes from being exploited prior to them actually being used. So in other words, like if your system's above a certain complexity threshold, you're never going to be self-sovereign. This is my kind of essential claim. And this is why Bitcoin more or less tries to be so fucking conservative with everything they do, because they're terrified of complexity. They're terrified of it because once you get enough complexity, you need companies running to actually keep things going. But if you can keep the complexity threshold minimal in the way that we have with the Urbit system and Nock, all kinds of crazy things open up. Not only in terms of the amount of development that you could do and the amount and the speed at which you can execute on crazy state-of-the-art stuff, but also just like, once, I mean, in a few years, anyone's going to be able to run one of these things, run their entire shard without really knowing anything about it, because that's kind of what Urbit does. Urbit is a personal server. So it's totally feasible that you could store all of your blockchain state that you care about on your personal server without needing to know anything about a personal server in a few years. So again, totally novel. Let's think. Anything else? Yes. So we had to actually build a build system in order to compile these contracts in this way. So we reconstituted another kernel module in a slightly modified way. You might say, well, why does Urbit not do this stuff for you? And it actually basically does, is what I'm telling you. Like, we're writing these like mini components, which are just kind of like put together pieces of parts that are in the kernel modules that are specifically built for their use cases. We just have a different design space. We have different constraints that we're building against, and so we need slightly reconfigured versions of some of these tools. Like, we're using the compiler in funny ways where we like strip the types off the things that we're building and then like mess with the raw like generated compiled nouns so that we can basically compress their size on chain. Like, no one would need to do that in the kernel normally. So basically, we're just doing funny versions of half of the kernel. We're doing funny versions of the build system, funny versions of the user space vein. So we like all this stuff, basically. And so I think that what's cool about it is basically that we've been able to build out a transaction engine, which we've built it out in such a way that we'll be able to parallelize it. All of the reads will be fully parallel via scries, and all of the writes will be fully parallel in an optimistic parallel system, which we kind of independently derived that Solana and I believe StarkNet also. So I know StarkNet currently doesn't use it, but will, and then Solana does use an optimistic parallel system. So basically what it constitutes is you run all the transactions parallel, and then if any of them touch the same state, you pick the one that's cheaper and you throw it away and do it in another pass. So you run it through in another pass, and you pick a number of passes you're going to do when you first start. And so the advantage of these things is that basically you can execute them really, really, really fast and have extremely high throughput. So it's fun because you can have extremely high throughput in this situation and not really worry at all about, well, Nock is slow, because you're making full use of your machine at every point in time in ways that traditional languages that are widely used, like Solidity, can't do. So, and that's about all I have in terms of the actual specific technical details. But if any of you would like to take questions, I could do that for a short period of time. Mark. So Mark's question, So Mark's question was, theoretically, if you had a very large block, or if you had a lot of block space on layer 1 or in your layer 2, for instance, how would you change your approach? And so my claim would be that in practice, the only real difference would be not to the transaction engine itself, but to the actual sharding and rollup mechanisms. So basically, like, rather than doing shards and rollups, you would just slap all of this parallel transaction execution into your one big block and call it a day. None of this, I mean, even with large blocks, you still want to have efficient computation that's running like extremely well and in parallel and not taking up more space than it actually needs. And none of the optimizations that I described are particularly expensive. So nothing would really change. You would just basically run the same transaction engine with a different kind of wrapper. Is that good? Yeah. Anything else? Sure. Things like what? Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. So like the key, okay, so to reiterate his question again, Mark basically said, so Solana and Facebook in some cases use the Berkeley packet filter VM in order to basically get extremely fast computation, because there's hardware that's built for that VM that basically is solely optimized as basically an ASIC for executing that VM, because it's often used in network controllers and packet routers to basically filter packets extremely quickly at, I don't know the order of magnitude, 100 gigabyte a second. And so Mark's question was, what advantages does not give you over an extremely tightly specified VM like that? And so again, I would first harken back to simplicity. The simplicity of understanding and grappling with the actual data formats and the instructions and data storage, et cetera, is just very, very nice if you basically, and tractable, if you have an extremely tightly specified language. And then further, I would say it's just way, way easier to do proofs of a language like this, particularly given that for not itself, the entire VM state is at all times stored in two binary trees, the subject and the formula, which in the Berkeley packet filter format, I forget the exact semantics of the VM, whether it's a stack machine or what, but it's not going to give you that tight of a memory model. Anything else? Looks good. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Drew.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. That wraps it up for the evening. We have till probably about 9:30, 9:45. Hang out, finish up the beers. Enjoy yourselves. Thanks everybody for showing up, and we look forward to next time. Hopefully, see you at Assembly Miami.